Every new year begins the same way. A quiet belief that this time will be different. That discipline will last. That motivation won't disappear after a few weeks. That the version of you who sets the goal will finally become the version who finishes it. But somewhere between January and February, something breaks. Not the goal. Not the plan. Something deeper. The energy fades. Old habits return. And once again, you're left wondering why change feels so difficult, even when you want it so badly. This isn't a failure of willpower. And it's not because you didn't try hard enough. It's because most people are taught the wrong way to change. This audiobook isn't about chasing motivation or forcing discipline. It's about understanding why habits fail quietly, how identity shapes behavior, and what actually creates consistency when excitement disappears. If you've ever promised yourself that this year would be different, and watched that promise slowly fade, this isn't another reminder to try harder. It's an explanation of what you were never taught. And once you understand it, the way you approach change will never be the same. The quiet cycle of broken promises. Every attempt at change begins long before action. It begins in a private moment, usually unnoticed by others, when a person quietly acknowledges that something in their life is no longer working. There is no applause in this moment. No certainty. Only awareness. A realization that the current way of living, thinking, or behaving is creating consequences that can no longer be ignored. This moment often arrives late at night, early in the morning, or during a pause in routine, when distractions fade and truth becomes harder to avoid. At first, this realization feels heavy. But almost immediately, the mind searches for relief. Relief comes in the form of a promise. A declaration, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes kept internal, that things will change. That this pattern will end. That effort will finally lead to results. This promise is powerful because it creates emotional movement. It turns discomfort into hope. It replaces guilt with intention. This is why the beginning of change feels so good. Not because the habit itself is easy, but because the mind feels relieved. It believes it has taken control. It believes the future is now different simply because a decision has been made. The brain rewards this belief with motivation. Dopamine rises not because progress has been made, but because the idea of progress feels possible. In these early days, discipline feels natural. Waking up early does not feel like punishment. Avoiding distractions does not feel like deprivation. Effort feels purposeful rather than draining. People mistake this feeling for transformation. They assume that because it feels different, it is different. They assume the struggle is over. But what they are experiencing is not change. It is novelty. Novelty temporarily overrides resistance. The brain treats new behaviors as interesting, even when they are difficult. This is why starting something new often feels easier than continuing it. The challenge is masked by curiosity. The discomfort is muted by excitement. The effort is justified by the belief that this time it will last. As days pass, novelty fades. The habit stops feeling special. The routine becomes ordinary. And when something becomes ordinary, the brain stops rewarding it with excitement. This is where reality returns. The same alarm that once felt empowering now feels intrusive. The same discipline that once felt aligned now feels forced. The habit has not changed, but the emotional reward has disappeared. And when the reward disappears, the mind begins to resist. Resistance does not arrive as a loud refusal. It arrives as a whisper. A suggestion. A negotiation. It sounds reasonable. You worked hard yesterday. You can rest today. One day won't make a difference. You can start again tomorrow. These thoughts are not destructive by themselves. What makes them dangerous is their frequency. Each small exception feels harmless. Each skipped action feels justified. But consistency is not broken in one dramatic moment. It erodes slowly, quietly, invisibly. The first missed day creates a subtle discomfort. Not guilt yet, just awareness. The second missed day creates doubt. The third missed day creates distance. The habit begins to feel foreign. And with distance comes identity shift. Instead of thinking, I missed my habit, the mind begins to think, I struggle with consistency. Instead of, I took a break, it becomes, I always fall off. This shift is subtle, but it is everything. The behavior is no longer separate from the self. Failure is no longer an event. It becomes a trait. Once identity begins to change, effort loses its power. A person who believes they are inconsistent will subconsciously act in ways that confirm it. Not because they want to fail, but because the mind seeks coherence. It wants beliefs and actions to align. Acting consistently now feels unnatural. Inconsistency feels familiar. This is why people often quit entirely after missing only a few days. The habit itself was never the real struggle. The real struggle is the story the mind tells once the habit is broken. Shame appears. Self-judgment follows. And with shame comes avoidance. Avoidance protects the ego. Quitting completely is less painful than trying again and failing again. The mind would rather abandon the goal than repeatedly confront evidence that challenges its identity. This is the moment where most people believe they lack willpower. They look at their past attempts and see a pattern of failure. They conclude that they are simply not built for discipline. They stop trusting themselves. They lower expectations. They adjust goals downward not because they want less, but because disappointment hurts more than stagnation. What they do not see is that this pattern is not unique to them. It repeats across lives, cultures, and generations. The cycle is not personal. It is structural. People fail not because they are weak, but because they rely on motivation in a system that punishes inconsistency. They expect emotions to remain stable in a world that guarantees fluctuation. They design habits that require constant effort and then blame themselves when effort collapses. This cycle repeats year after year. New goal. New promise. Initial motivation. Gradual resistance. Self-doubt. Quitting. Normalization. The failure becomes familiar. Familiarity feels safe. And so the cycle resets. Over time, this repetition creates a deeper wound. People stop believing change is possible. Not intellectually, but emotionally. They still want better lives. They still admire discipline in others. But internally, they assume it is not meant for them. This belief is devastating because it limits action before action even begins. Why try if you already expect to fail? Why commit if history feels heavier than hope? The tragedy is that nothing is inherently wrong with these people. Their mistake was never lack of desire. It was misunderstanding the nature of change itself. Change does not fail because people stop trying. It fails because it was built on a fragile foundation. A foundation made of motivation, emotion, and temporary excitement. When that foundation cracks, everything above it collapses. Real change requires something different. something quieter, something slower, something that does not depend on how you feel in the moment. And until that foundation is understood, the cycle will continue, no matter how strong the desire to escape it. As this cycle repeats, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside the mind. The person no longer sees each failed attempt as an isolated incident. Instead, the failures start to merge into a single narrative. A story about who they are and what they are capable of. The mind does not remember events objectively. It remembers patterns. And once a pattern is perceived, it becomes truth in the emotional sense, even if it is not logically accurate. This is how people begin to distrust themselves. Not because they lack intelligence or awareness, but because their past experiences have taught them a lesson they never consciously chose to learn. That lesson is simple and destructive: effort does not last. Every new attempt now carries the weight of previous disappointment. Even before the habit begins, doubt is already present. The mind asks, quietly but persistently, how long this will last. This question changes everything. It weakens commitment before action even begins. Why willpower is a losing strategy. For generations, people have been taught that discipline is a personal trait. Something you either have or you don't. Something that separates the strong from the weak, the successful from the average, the achievers from the quitters. This belief is so deeply embedded in culture that most people never question it. They simply assume that if change is difficult, it must be because they are not disciplined enough. This assumption feels logical on the surface, but it collapses under closer examination. If discipline were purely a personal trait, then the same person would show equal discipline across all areas of life. But this is rarely the case. Someone may be highly disciplined at work and completely undisciplined with health. Someone may be consistent with exercise but unable to control phone usage. Someone may manage finances well but struggle with focus. These inconsistencies reveal an uncomfortable truth. Discipline is not a stable internal resource. It is context-dependent. It changes based on environment, structure, and friction. And this is where the myth of willpower begins to unravel. Willpower is often treated as an unlimited internal fuel. But in reality, it behaves more like a fragile battery. It drains with stress, lack of sleep, emotional load, decision-making, and environmental pressure. Expecting willpower to sustain long-term habits is like expecting a phone battery to last forever without recharging. Most habits fail not during moments of clarity or intention, but during moments of depletion. After a long day. During emotional stress. When energy is low. When the mind is crowded. These are not exceptions. These are the conditions of real life. When habits are designed to require willpower, they collapse precisely when they are needed most. This is why people who rely on willpower often experience cycles of intensity followed by burnout. They push hard, demand more from themselves, and maintain control for a short period. But eventually, depletion catches up. The effort becomes unsustainable. And when collapse happens, it feels sudden and personal. The problem is not effort itself. The problem is dependence on effort as the primary mechanism of change. Willpower-based habits require constant decision-making. Every day becomes a test. Should I do this today? Should I resist this temptation? Should I push through this discomfort? Each decision consumes mental energy. Over time, this creates decision fatigue. Decision fatigue does not announce itself loudly. It shows up as avoidance, procrastination, and impulsive choices. The mind seeks relief from constant self-control. And relief usually comes in the form of comfort, not discipline. This is why habits that rely on willpower feel harder over time instead of easier. The mental cost accumulates. What once felt manageable begins to feel exhausting. And eventually, the mind chooses the path of least resistance. The people who succeed long-term are not those who fight this tendency harder. They are those who design around it. They reduce the number of decisions required. They eliminate friction. They structure their environment so that the desired behavior happens with minimal effort. This is not weakness. It is intelligence. But most people misunderstand this approach. They believe reducing friction means lowering standards. They equate ease with laziness. They assume that struggle is proof of value. This belief keeps them trapped in cycles of unnecessary resistance. In reality, ease is not the enemy of progress. Resistance is. Habits that are hard to start are hard to sustain. Habits that require daily courage are fragile. Habits that depend on motivation are temporary. Consider how often people attempt to improve behavior by adding rules instead of removing obstacles. They create strict schedules instead of flexible systems. They demand perfection instead of consistency. These approaches feel disciplined, but they are brittle. Brittle systems break under pressure. And life guarantees pressure. The alternative is designing habits that survive stress. Habits that work when motivation is low. Habits that do not collapse when routines are disrupted. This requires a shift from self-control to self-design. Self-design begins with understanding how behavior actually works. Behavior is not driven primarily by intention. It is driven by cues, friction, and reward. What is visible gets attention. What is easy gets done. What is rewarded gets repeated. People often overestimate the power of intention and underestimate the power of environment. They assume that because they want something strongly, they will act accordingly. But desire alone does not override convenience. This is why environment quietly dictates behavior. A phone within reach is more tempting than one in another room. Junk food in sight is harder to resist than junk food that requires effort to access. Distractions that are easy to open will be opened. None of this is a moral failure. It is human behavior responding to stimuli. The problem arises when people blame themselves for predictable outcomes instead of redesigning their environment. They feel guilty for giving in to temptation instead of asking why the temptation was so accessible in the first place. Willpower is most effective when used sparingly. It should be reserved for designing systems, not enforcing behavior daily. Using willpower to set up an environment is far more powerful than using it to fight that environment every day. But even environment alone is not enough. There is another layer that determines whether habits stick or collapse under pressure. That layer is identity. When habits conflict with identity, they require constant effort. When habits align with identity, they require very little. This is why some behaviors feel natural for certain people and exhausting for others. Identity shapes perception. It influences what feels normal, what feels uncomfortable, and what feels unnecessary. A person who sees themselves as organized does not need willpower to organize. A person who sees themselves as disciplined does not feel discipline as effort. Most people attempt to change behavior without changing identity. They treat habits as external tasks rather than expressions of self. This creates internal resistance. Resistance is not always conscious. It shows up as procrastination, forgetfulness, and inconsistency. The mind subtly avoids behaviors that feel misaligned with identity. This is why forcing habits rarely works long-term. Force creates tension. Tension seeks release. And release often comes in the form of quitting. Understanding this shifts the focus from effort to alignment. Instead of asking how to become more disciplined, the better question becomes how to design habits that do not require discipline to survive. This is the beginning of real habit formation. Not through pressure, but through structure. Not through motivation, but through design. The mistake most people make is trying to win a battle that does not need to be fought. They fight their own psychology instead of working with it. They exhaust themselves trying to be stronger instead of becoming smarter. Once this realization sinks in, the entire approach to change begins to shift. Effort is no longer the primary tool. Design becomes the priority. Identity becomes the anchor. This is where habits stop feeling like punishment and start feeling like continuity. This is where consistency becomes sustainable. But this understanding alone is not enough. It must be applied correctly. And that requires a deeper look at how systems replace willpower, and why environment often matters more than motivation. That is where this section is headed next. Once people begin to recognize that willpower is unreliable, an uncomfortable realization follows. If effort alone cannot sustain change, then the entire way habits are approached must be reconsidered. This realization often feels threatening at first, because it challenges deeply held beliefs about strength, character, and merit. Many people equate struggle with worth. They believe that if something is difficult, it must be valuable, and if it is easy, it must be insignificant. This belief creates a silent conflict. On one side is the desire for lasting change. On the other is the attachment to struggle as proof of seriousness. People feel guilty making habits easier, as if ease undermines legitimacy. They assume that if a habit does not require sacrifice, it does not count. This mindset keeps people trapped in ineffective systems. They deliberately choose difficult routines, strict rules, and rigid schedules because these feel virtuous. But virtue does not guarantee durability. In fact, systems built on constant sacrifice are the most fragile. Durability comes from alignment, not intensity. Habits that survive are not the ones that demand the most effort. They are the ones that fit naturally into daily life. They respect energy limits. They adapt to circumstances. They remain intact even when conditions are imperfect. This is why focusing on environment is so powerful. Environment does not rely on emotion. It operates quietly and consistently. It shapes behavior without demanding conscious effort. When an environment supports a habit, the habit feels obvious. When an environment resists a habit, the habit feels exhausting. Most people underestimate this influence because it feels indirect. But indirect forces often have the strongest impact. Consider how often behavior changes when context changes. People eat differently on vacation. They sleep differently in new surroundings. They act differently around different people. These changes occur without intention. The environment cues behavior automatically. This reveals an important truth. Behavior is not driven primarily by desire or discipline. It is driven by cues and convenience. Most people attempt to change behavior by changing desire. They tell themselves they should want something more. But wanting is not enough when cues constantly pull in the opposite direction. A person who wants to read more but keeps their phone within reach is fighting a losing battle. A person who wants to eat better but keeps unhealthy food visible is relying on constant restraint. A person who wants to focus but surrounds themselves with distractions is demanding unnatural behavior. None of this is a moral failure. It is predictable human behavior responding to stimuli. The most effective habit builders remove reliance on restraint. They design their environment so that the desired behavior is the easiest option. They reduce friction for good habits and increase friction for bad ones. This does not require dramatic changes. Small adjustments compound powerfully. Placing an object in sight increases usage. Placing it out of sight reduces usage. Making an action easier increases frequency. Making it harder reduces frequency. These principles work regardless of motivation. They work even when energy is low. They work when discipline fails. But many people resist this approach because it feels passive. They want to feel in control. They want to feel strong. They want to believe that success comes from inner force rather than external design. This desire for control leads people to ignore the simplest solutions. They try to overpower their environment instead of reshaping it. And in doing so, they exhaust themselves. There is another cost to relying on willpower that is often overlooked. Willpower-based habits create constant self-surveillance. The mind is always watching itself, evaluating performance, judging consistency, and tracking failures. This creates mental tension. Living under constant self-monitoring is draining. It turns daily life into a performance. Every decision feels consequential. Every slip feels like evidence. This emotional pressure makes habits feel heavy and joyless. Habits that last do not require constant self-judgment. They operate quietly in the background. They do not demand attention. They do not require internal debate. They simply happen. This is why automation is so powerful. Not technological automation, but behavioral automation. When actions become automatic, they stop consuming mental energy. They free attention for other things. Automatic behaviors are not accidental. They are the result of repetition under consistent conditions. When conditions remain stable, behavior stabilizes. Most people sabotage this process by constantly changing their approach. New plans. New schedules. New strategies. They reset the system before it can settle. They mistake novelty for progress. Stability is boring. But stability is necessary for automation. Without repetition, habits cannot form. Without consistency, behavior remains fragile. This is where identity again becomes central. Identity determines whether repetition feels meaningful or pointless. When behavior aligns with identity, repetition reinforces belief. When behavior conflicts with identity, repetition feels forced. A person who sees themselves as someone trying to change will always feel effort. A person who sees themselves as someone who lives this way experiences continuity. This shift is subtle but profound. It moves the focus from effort to embodiment. From trying to being. From pressure to alignment. Willpower is required to initiate change. But it should not be required to maintain it. If maintenance demands constant effort, the system is flawed. The goal of habit design is not to test strength, but to reduce reliance on strength. The best systems make the right behavior easy and the wrong behavior inconvenient. They work quietly, consistently, and without drama. People who succeed are often mistaken for being naturally disciplined. In reality, they are simply less exposed to temptation. Their environment protects them. Their systems carry them. Their identity supports them. This is not luck. It is design. Understanding this removes shame. It reframes failure as feedback rather than flaw. It encourages experimentation instead of self-criticism. Instead of asking why they failed again, people can ask what made failure easy. Instead of blaming themselves, they can adjust conditions. This mindset transforms habit building from a moral struggle into a practical process. It removes emotional weight and replaces it with curiosity. Curiosity leads to refinement. Refinement leads to stability. Stability leads to consistency. And consistency, not intensity, is what creates lasting change. But there is still one missing piece. Even with environment and systems in place, habits can still collapse if they are not anchored deeply enough. That anchor is identity. The final part of this section will explore how identity locks habits in place, and why aligning behavior with self-image removes the need for constant willpower entirely. The final weakness of willpower-based change reveals itself slowly, often after months or years of repeated effort. Even when people manage to push through resistance, even when they force habits to stick temporarily, something fragile remains beneath the surface. The behavior exists, but it is not stable. It depends on vigilance. It depends on constant self-control. And anything that depends on constant vigilance eventually collapses. This collapse does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like gradual neglect. Sometimes it looks like resentment toward the habit itself. The behavior begins to feel like a burden rather than a benefit. People continue only because stopping feels like failure. The habit becomes something they endure rather than something they embody. This is a critical moment, because habits that are endured are not sustainable. Endurance requires energy. Energy fluctuates. And when energy drops, endurance fails. This is where identity either saves the habit or destroys it. Identity is not just how people describe themselves to others. It is the quiet internal answer to the question, what kind of person am I? This answer shapes behavior more powerfully than goals, motivation, or discipline ever could. When habits are built on willpower alone, they sit outside identity. They feel like obligations imposed from above rather than expressions of self. The mind treats them as temporary assignments. Something to maintain for a while, not something to become. In contrast, when habits are built on identity, they feel natural. They do not require justification. They do not demand explanation. They simply make sense. A person who identifies as someone who moves daily does not debate whether to exercise. A person who identifies as someone who respects their time does not argue with themselves about distractions. A person who identifies as someone who follows through does not need motivation to continue. Identity removes friction by removing debate. This is why identity-based habits survive conditions that destroy willpower-based habits. Stress, fatigue, disruption, and uncertainty do not eliminate identity. They may slow behavior, but they do not erase belief. Most people attempt to build habits backward. They focus on outcomes first, behaviors second, and identity last, if at all. They say they want results, so they try to change actions. But without identity alignment, actions feel temporary. Identity-based change reverses this order. It begins with belief. Then behavior follows. And outcomes emerge naturally. This does not mean identity is created through affirmations or self-talk. Identity is built through evidence. Each small action provides proof. Each repetition reinforces belief. This is why small habits are so powerful. Not because they create immediate results, but because they create identity evidence. They prove to the mind that change is not a performance. It is a pattern. When identity and behavior align, willpower becomes unnecessary. Not because life becomes easy, but because behavior becomes self-reinforcing. The habit supports the identity. The identity protects the habit. This creates stability. Stability does not mean perfection. Identity-based habits still allow for mistakes. But mistakes do not threaten identity. They are seen as deviations, not definitions. Recovery becomes faster. Shame loses its grip. People often fear identity-based change because they believe it limits flexibility. They worry that committing to an identity will trap them. In reality, the opposite is true. Identity provides direction, not restriction. An identity does not dictate exact behavior. It guides choices under uncertainty. It reduces cognitive load. It simplifies decisions. This simplification is crucial in a world filled with constant stimuli. Without identity, every choice becomes a negotiation. With identity, many choices are resolved automatically. This is the final failure of willpower. It demands constant negotiation. It turns daily life into a series of internal battles. Over time, this exhausts the mind. Systems and identity eliminate the battle entirely. They create default behaviors. They allow life to flow without constant resistance. People who master this are often misunderstood. They are called disciplined, strong, or extreme. But internally, their lives feel simpler, not harder. Their habits feel obvious, not heroic. They do not rely on daily motivation. They rely on alignment. They do not fight temptation constantly. They avoid exposure where possible. They do not push harder when exhausted. They adjust systems instead. This is not weakness. It is wisdom. The final realization is this. Willpower is not something to be strengthened indefinitely. It is something to be conserved. Use strategically. Applied during moments of design, not moments of execution. Use willpower to set up systems. Use willpower to reshape environment. Use willpower to define identity. Then step back and let structure do the work. When habits are designed this way, consistency stops feeling fragile. It becomes predictable. It becomes resilient. This is why some people change once and never look back. Not because they are superior, but because they stopped relying on the wrong mechanism. They stopped trying to overpower themselves. And instead, they learned to work with themselves. Identity is the real engine of lasting change. At the deepest level, habits are not about what you do. They are about who you believe you are. This truth is uncomfortable for many people because it removes the illusion that change is only about effort. It forces a confrontation with self-image, self-trust, and long-held beliefs about personal limits. Every person carries an internal identity. This identity is not consciously chosen. It is slowly constructed from past experiences, repeated behaviors, and emotional memories. It is shaped by success and failure, praise and criticism, consistency and collapse. Over time, this identity becomes the lens through which all behavior is filtered. This is why two people can face the same situation and act completely differently. One sees an opportunity. The other sees a threat. One feels capable. The other feels resistance. The situation is identical, but the identity interpreting it is not. Most people attempt to change habits without realizing they are working against an identity that was built over years. They try to force new behaviors onto an old self-image. This creates friction. And friction creates resistance. For example, someone who sees themselves as not disciplined experiences every disciplined action as unnatural. Each attempt feels like an exception rather than an expression. The behavior feels borrowed, temporary, and fragile. The moment effort weakens, the old identity reasserts itself. This is why habits that are not identity-aligned feel exhausting even when they are technically simple. The difficulty does not come from the action itself, but from the internal conflict it creates. The mind is constantly asking whether this behavior truly belongs. When behavior conflicts with identity, the brain resists quietly. It produces hesitation, distraction, procrastination, and doubt. These reactions are often mistaken for laziness. In reality, they are signals of misalignment. Identity operates as a self-preserving system. It seeks consistency above all else. It does not care whether the identity is helpful or harmful. It only cares that behavior aligns with belief. This is why people unconsciously sabotage positive change. Not because they want to fail, but because success threatens the current identity. Becoming consistent challenges the belief that I always fall off. Becoming disciplined challenges the belief that I'm just not that kind of person. Changing behavior without addressing identity creates cognitive tension. And the brain resolves tension by reverting to familiar patterns. This is also why negative habits persist so stubbornly. They are not just behaviors. They are proofs. Each repetition reinforces the belief that this is who I am. The habit becomes part of the self-story. People often underestimate how powerful this self-story is. It shapes motivation, perception, and action. It determines what feels possible and what feels unrealistic. It quietly limits ambition before effort even begins. When someone says, "I could never do that," they are not making a logical assessment. They are expressing an identity boundary. Breaking habits requires crossing identity boundaries. And crossing identity boundaries is emotionally uncomfortable. It feels like betraying the self you know, even if that self is limiting. This is why identity-based change must be gradual. Sudden, dramatic change often fails because it creates too much distance from the existing identity. The mind rejects it as inauthentic. Small habits succeed because they create small identity shifts. Each repetition provides subtle evidence that the old identity may not be fully accurate. Over time, this evidence accumulates. This accumulation is critical. Identity does not change through declarations. It changes through proof. The mind does not believe what it is told. It believes what it experiences repeatedly. When someone consistently performs a behavior, even in a small way, the mind begins to adjust its self-image. The shift is slow and often unconscious. But once it begins, it accelerates. This is the moment when habits stop feeling forced and start feeling natural. The behavior no longer feels like something you are trying to do. It feels like something you simply do. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Motivation becomes less important. Willpower becomes optional. The habit begins to defend itself because it is now tied to identity. People often mistake this stage for discipline. But discipline is effortful. Identity is effortless. This is why identity-based habits survive stress, disruption, and fatigue. They are not dependent on optimal conditions. They are expressions of self. Most people never reach this stage because they abandon habits too early. They quit before enough evidence accumulates to shift identity. They expect change to feel different immediately. When it doesn't, they assume it isn't working. In reality, identity change lags behind behavior. The behavior comes first. The belief follows. But because belief changes slowly, people underestimate progress. This misunderstanding leads to premature abandonment. People quit at the exact moment the habit is about to become stable. They leave just before identity begins to shift. Understanding this reframes the entire process of change. It reveals why patience matters more than intensity. Why repetition matters more than motivation. Why small actions matter more than dramatic effort. Identity is not something you choose once. It is something you vote for daily. Each action is a ballot. Each repetition counts. Most people cast conflicting votes. One day they act aligned. The next day they act against. The identity remains unstable. The habit remains fragile. Lasting change requires consistent voting. Not perfection, but direction. Over time, the votes accumulate. The identity solidifies. And behavior stabilizes. This is the real engine of habit formation. Not willpower. Not motivation. Not discipline. Identity. And once identity shifts, the question is no longer whether you can maintain the habit. The habit maintains itself. As identity begins to shift, the experience of effort changes in a fundamental way. What once felt heavy starts to feel lighter, not because the task itself has become easier, but because resistance has decreased. Resistance is not always physical or practical. Most often, it is psychological. It comes from the friction between who you believe you are and what you are trying to do. When behavior aligns with identity, that friction dissolves. The mind no longer argues. It no longer negotiates. The internal dialogue that once consumed energy fades into the background. Action becomes simpler, not because life is simpler, but because conflict has been removed. This is why people often describe successful habit change as feeling natural after a certain point. They are not exaggerating. The habit has been absorbed into the self-concept. It no longer requires justification. Before this shift, every action feels like a decision. After it, the same action feels like continuity. Most people underestimate how exhausting constant decision-making is. Each choice carries cognitive weight. When habits require daily choices, they drain mental energy even if the behavior itself is minor. Over time, this drain accumulates. Identity-based habits remove the need for repeated decisions. The decision has already been made at the level of self-definition. Action follows automatically. This automaticity is often misunderstood. It is not mindlessness. It is clarity. The mind knows what fits and what does not. Choices are filtered before they reach consciousness. For example, a person who sees themselves as someone who values deep focus does not need to debate whether to open distracting apps. The behavior feels inconsistent with self-image. The choice is resolved before it becomes a struggle. This internal filtering is one of the most powerful benefits of identity-based change. It conserves energy. It reduces temptation. It simplifies life. But reaching this point requires patience. Identity does not change quickly because it is built on evidence, not intention. The mind trusts patterns, not promises. This is where many people become discouraged. They act consistently for a short time but do not feel different. They assume the habit is not working. In reality, it is working quietly beneath the surface. Identity shifts slowly because it must be stable. Rapid identity change would make the self feel unreliable. The mind resists sudden transformation because it values predictability. Small habits work precisely because they respect this resistance. They introduce change without triggering alarm. Each repetition is small enough to be accepted, but significant enough to contribute evidence. Over time, these small evidences accumulate. The mind begins to adjust its internal narrative. The story changes from "I'm trying" to "I'm becoming." And eventually, to "This is who I am." This progression is subtle and often invisible. People rarely notice the moment identity shifts. They simply notice that the habit feels easier than it used to. That resistance has faded. That skipping feels stranger than continuing. This is why people who succeed often struggle to explain how they did it. From the outside, their behavior looks disciplined. From the inside, it feels obvious. The danger arises when people mistake identity-based change for talent or natural ability. They assume others are simply wired differently. This belief discourages effort and reinforces limitation. In reality, identity is built, not inherited. It is shaped through repeated action. Anyone can change identity, but not instantly and not through force. Another important aspect of identity-based change is how it interacts with failure. Failure does not disappear. Mistakes still happen. Habits are still broken occasionally. But the meaning of failure changes. For someone without identity alignment, failure feels like confirmation of inadequacy. It reinforces the belief that change is impossible. For someone with identity alignment, failure feels like an anomaly. It does not threaten self-image. This difference determines whether a person quits or recovers. Recovery is the true test of habit strength. Anyone can act when conditions are perfect. Only those with aligned identity return after disruption. Identity-based habits recover faster because the mind wants consistency. It seeks to restore alignment. Returning to the habit feels like returning to oneself. This is why shame is so destructive to habit formation. Shame attacks identity. It tells the person that failure defines them. Once identity is damaged, behavior collapses. Successful habit builders avoid shame. They treat mistakes as information, not evidence. They adjust systems without self-judgment. This emotional neutrality is not indifference. It is maturity. It allows growth without collapse. Another overlooked element of identity-based change is social reinforcement. Identity is influenced not only by personal behavior but also by social context. How others perceive you matters because it reinforces self-image. When someone begins to act consistently, others notice. They comment. They expect. These expectations reinforce identity. The person begins to see themselves through the eyes of others. This social feedback loop can be powerful. It can stabilize habits or destabilize them. Surrounding oneself with people who reinforce the desired identity makes change easier. Being surrounded by those who reinforce the old identity makes change harder. This does not mean identity depends on external validation. But external cues accelerate internal belief. Most people ignore this factor. They try to change alone in environments that constantly remind them of their old self. This creates friction. Aligning environment, behavior, and social context creates a strong identity loop. Each element reinforces the others. Change becomes resilient. Identity-based change is not dramatic. It does not rely on extreme measures. It does not require radical transformation. It builds quietly, repetition by repetition. This quietness is deceptive. It makes progress feel slow. But once identity shifts, progress accelerates. This is why small habits produce large results over time. Not because the habits themselves are impressive, but because they change the person performing them. This is the point where habits stop being a project and start being a lifestyle. Where effort gives way to alignment. Where change becomes stable. But there is one final piece to understand. Identity is not fixed once and for all. It must be maintained. It must be protected. It must be reinforced. The final part of this section will explore how identity can erode, how to prevent regression, and how to ensure that habits remain anchored even as life changes. Identity, once formed, is powerful, but it is not indestructible. This is where many people misunderstand long-term change. They assume that once a habit feels natural, it is permanent. In reality, identity must be continuously reinforced through behavior. When reinforcement stops, identity slowly weakens, and old patterns begin to reappear. This does not happen suddenly. It happens quietly. A missed action here, a rationalization there. At first, nothing feels wrong. But over time, the internal narrative begins to shift. The identity that once felt solid starts to feel conditional. This erosion is subtle, which makes it dangerous. People rarely notice it until the habit collapses completely. They are surprised by relapse because they assumed the work was finished. In truth, identity-based habits require maintenance, not through force, but through consistency. The goal is not perfection. The goal is continuity. One of the most common reasons identity erodes is environmental change. A new job, a new routine, travel, stress, or emotional upheaval can disrupt behavior patterns. When behavior is disrupted long enough, identity begins to question itself. This is why major life changes often lead to regression. Not because people lose discipline, but because the cues that supported identity disappear. Without cues, behavior weakens. Without behavior, identity fades. The solution is not to avoid change, but to prepare for it. Identity-based habit builders anticipate disruption. They simplify habits during unstable periods. They focus on minimum viable actions rather than optimal performance. This flexibility protects identity. It allows the self-image to remain intact even when conditions are imperfect. Another threat to identity is overconfidence. When habits feel easy, people sometimes assume they no longer need structure. They abandon systems. They stop tracking. They stop reflecting. This creates vulnerability. Systems are not training wheels. They are anchors. Removing them too early allows drift. Identity-based change thrives on humility. It recognizes that consistency is fragile and must be respected. There is also the danger of identity rigidity. When identity becomes too narrow, it can break under pressure. For example, someone who defines themselves as perfectly disciplined may collapse after a single failure. The identity is too brittle. Healthy identity is flexible. It allows for mistakes without self-attack. It defines consistency as returning, not never failing. This flexibility is crucial for longevity. Another overlooked factor is emotional association. Identity is not purely cognitive. It is emotional. If habits are associated with stress, pressure, or self-criticism, identity resists reinforcement. Over time, the habit becomes emotionally draining. This is why habits tied to self-respect last longer than habits tied to self-punishment. When behavior feels like care rather than control, identity strengthens. People who succeed long-term often reframe habits as expressions of values rather than obligations. The habit becomes a way of honoring oneself, not fixing oneself. This reframing reduces internal resistance. It aligns action with meaning. Meaning is the deepest reinforcement of identity. When habits are connected to purpose, they persist even when motivation fades. This is why habits linked only to external outcomes, appearance, money, approval, are more fragile. When outcomes are delayed or disrupted, identity loses reinforcement. Habits linked to internal values, growth, integrity, mastery, are more resilient. The reward is intrinsic. Another powerful reinforcement is reflection. Regularly noticing and acknowledging consistency strengthens identity. The mind records evidence more effectively when attention is directed. This does not mean self-praise or arrogance. It means awareness. Quiet recognition that reinforces self-image. Without reflection, progress can feel invisible. And what feels invisible feels meaningless. Reflection makes identity tangible. This is why journaling, tracking, or simple mental check-ins matter. They transform repetition into recognition. Recognition reinforces belief. Belief reinforces behavior. Behavior reinforces identity. This loop is the foundation of lasting change. At this point, it becomes clear why most people fail at habits. They focus on outcomes instead of identity. They chase results instead of alignment. They push behavior without reshaping belief. They ask, "How can I do this?" instead of asking, "Who must I become for this to feel natural?" That single shift changes everything. When identity leads, behavior follows. When behavior leads without identity, resistance grows. This is why sustainable change is not about intensity. It is about consistency. Not about motivation, but about meaning. Not about force, but about alignment. Identity-based habits do not require constant effort. They require ongoing commitment to self-definition. Every day offers a choice. Not a dramatic choice, but a quiet one. To act in alignment or drift away. To reinforce identity or weaken it. Each action is a vote. Each repetition is a signal. Each day shapes the person you are becoming. This is the real work of habit change. Invisible. Gradual. Profound. And once identity is aligned, habits no longer feel like a struggle. They feel like a reflection.